Well, I think things are pretty much what they've been for several months now. The war is lost. The Ukrainians have been largely annihilated. The sad part is that President Trump doesn't seem to be aware of that. He continues to repeat these utterly fictitious numbers and assessments that I guess he gets from the intelligence community, which is part of the problem. I don't know, but I mean, the notion that I think he made a comment yesterday, well, 8,000 men died in the last month. And of course, most of them were Russian, but still it's bad. You know, the Russians have been taking losses in single and double digits now for several months. The Ukrainians are losing thousands of people every week. This is just a slaughter. And I don't know why President Trump doesn't recognize that. Simply state the facts. The facts are Ukrainians have lost this war. Now, he can continue to rely on General Kellogg for fictional numbers, which is what he appears to be doing. But even worse, he can conclude that Russia is losing, according to General Kellogg, because the Russians haven't marched into Kyiv. The Russians haven't crossed in the upper river yet. It's a rather bizarre logic. There's never been any understanding in the West of certain things. Number one, President Trump has never recognized Russia's legitimate security interests in eastern Ukraine. He doesn't seem to understand that once we staged the coup in 2014, the war in Ukraine against Russians began almost immediately. And that war continued to rage for years until finally the Russians said enough is enough and intervened in eastern Ukraine. If you can't agree on the truth of what is actually going on and what has happened, how can you reach an agreement? Other words, if you come into this discussion with two separate sets of facts, what are you going to get? And the answer is nowhere. So I don't see President Trump coming out with anything. The other thing is that we're not in a very strong position because, as you pointed out, Clayton and Natalie earlier, we have led this war against Russia. All we have to do is go back to Biden. And now President Trump sounds just like Biden. Biden said in March, we've got to break Russia. It's not enough to harm Russia. We have to break it, destroy its economy. You know, we've got to rubble the ruble, remember? And then ultimately, we've got to get rid of Putin. Good Lord, what more do you want? When is Trump going to step forward and say, listen, I disavow all that nonsense. I'm not interested in doing any of that. Yes, if he really wants an end to the war, he has to distance himself from all of that nonsense. He hasn't done it. That's a huge problem, Clayton. Well, the clown that you're talking about has an estimated $1.1 billion in various bank accounts that he has stolen from all of the aid and assistance that we and our European allies have provided. And I know he's prepared to retire to either his $15 million estate somewhere south of Naples, Florida, or his massive chateau and vineyard in Italy. And he's got a private plane that's fueled and ready to go at moment's notice. I mean, the man is a criminal. That's the only way to look at it. He makes any organized crime boss look like an amateur. And the man continues to run around high on cocaine or whatever else it is that he's using at any given point in time and make outrageous statements. I don't know why President Trump puts up with it. Doesn't make any sense. He ought to just dismiss this man out of hand. And again, one wonders who is in charge. Who is the president of the United States? It's not just look what's happening with regard to our unconditional support for anything that President Netanyahu wants. At the same time, this is the president of the United States. We're the principal player that has been pushing this terribly stupid and counterproductive war in Ukraine. And he can't stop it by simply saying, my friend Zelensky, you're out of a job. We no longer recognize you as legitimate. We're cutting you off. Get out. Why bother turning it and say, well, you got to make a deal. What the hell with this deal? You've lost. Get out. Well, first, remember, all small states are permanently in the business of dragging large states into wars on their behalf. Other words, any small state that wants to survive like Israel and starts a war that it cannot possibly win without tremendous support from us has a permanent interest in dragging us in. Now, he's trying to tie us to the phony threat of an imminent Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which is not imminent and not likely unless we're stupid enough to put missiles and rockets on Taiwan that can reach the mainland. We've already got batteries of missiles sitting in the northern Philippines that can reach the Chinese mainland. Nobody talks about that. The Chinese are upset about it and don't understand it, but at the same time, they're not willing to invade the Philippines to get rid of it. But the point is that, China's a current boogeyman. So tie your future to the boogeyman and say, now we're all in this together. No, we're not. We're not in anything at all with Israel. Israel is controlling us for one simple reason. He's bought and paid for the United States Congress and the White House. And there's an old saying, there's nothing more reliable than a man you can buy for hard, cold, hard cash. And it looks like that's what he's got. And the audience that he's talking to, as I understand it, consists of large numbers of members of Congress. And I'm sure they've been handed cue cards for the 29th visit so that they all know when to stand up and give a standing ovation. He owns it. Now, how does he own it? Well, we know who the billionaires are in the United States, many of whom have dual citizenship, who have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into President Trump's campaign to get him into the White House and to buy up support for Israel on the Hill. It's worked. They're in control. The question is, how long will the American people put up with this? When do we hit the streets the way people have hit the streets in London? I don't know. Obviously not. I think we have to view General Kellogg as perhaps the leader of the coalition of the deluded. He's operating on the basis of information that is fundamentally false. We know that Ukrainians have now lost somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 million dead Ukrainian soldiers. The Russians have lost somewhere between 110 to 120,000 killed, and perhaps another 100,000 wounded, most of whom have returned to duty. Now, that's very important because the million or so casualties beyond the dead that the Ukrainians have sustained will never come back to duty. They are so badly wounded. They receive such terrible care and poor evacuation that there's no chance of those men ever returning to the battlefield. So return to duty is very important. The Ukrainians are in no position to do anything. And that's why the most humane thing we could do is to intervene and put an end to this. Now, why would General Kellogg state these bold-faced lies? Well, first, it may be that he wants desperately to believe this, and there is a habit in Washington of believing in what you want to believe regardless of the facts. If you go back to Vietnam in 1967, within the last 6 to 8 months of the year, William Westmoreland and McNamara and a host of other people were crossing back and forth around the United States, giving lectures to everybody on how we had turned the corner in Ukraine, in Vietnam. We were on the verge of winning. And then, in January of '68, the Tet Offensive occurred, and we did inflict during the offensive tremendous losses on the Vietnamese. But the Vietnamese at the time from the north demonstrated conclusively that we had not won the war. We had not turned any corner, that the war was a bottomless pit for resources and American manpower, that it was befuddled. We didn't know what we were doing. We were lost, and so the American people turned away from it. Johnson decided not to run for re-election, and the rest is history. Well, we're in a similar position right now in Ukraine. We went in there with the goals of harming Russia. Remember, the statements were made by Biden early on. Well, we're there to harm the Russians, to degrade them, to push this man Putin out of office, who is a dictator, has very weak support, and really will not sustain the losses that they're starting to take. All of that was utter and complete nonsense. So here we are 3+ years later, and we know where we're headed. We're headed to a Russian victory. Now, what does that victory look like? We seem to demand that the Russians march to the Polish border, which I don't think is in the interest of the Russians. They know the people in Western Ukraine don't want to be ruled from Moscow. They're perfectly willing to live with that. They simply will not tolerate Ukraine's membership in NATO. They want a neutral state in Ukraine, just as we have a neutral state today in Austria. That's what the Russians are looking for, and that makes perfect sense. Would we tolerate an alliance between Mexico and, say, China, and the presence of Chinese troops in Mexico? Of course not. The Russians are in very much the same position. We almost went to war over Cuba, an island 100 miles off the coast of the United States, for many of the same reasons. And we're acting as though this is incomprehensible in Moscow. It's not. It makes perfect sense. This war needs to end, and people like Kellogg should be sent off to the old folks' home. Find a nice card game. Let him go there and join it with his old friends, and he'll be fine. But he has no business in international relations. The other thing that's so frustrating is that he, like so many other Americans, know nothing about Russia or Eastern Europe, or I would say Europe in general. They don't know the history. They don't know what's happened there. They don't understand the people, the culture, the languages, the religion. And this, again, is what we went through in Vietnam. We went through it in Iraq. I remember people coming back and saying exactly what Robert McCamara said. McNamara said, well, the problem in Vietnam is we never understood the culture. Gee, what a blinding flash of the obvious. We never understood the people in Iraq either. The whole thing has been a catastrophe. We need to get out of this business. And that's really what that ex-essay is also about. Get out of the business of trying to meddle in other people's societies and tell them how to live. And of course, that brings us to the most recent example, which is the potential disaster over the horizon called Venezuela. How are we going to improve the drug problem inside the United States by attacking Venezuela? We're not. There are people using drugs. There are people in the United States selling drugs. Crack down on the network. Get control of your borders, your ports, your airports, your harbors. We have good optics right now on the border. Things look much better because there aren't tens of thousands of people lining up to pour into the country through open borders. That's good. But we still don't have control of the legal crossing points, the ports of entry, where the drug cartels can pay people $30,000 extra every month just to look the other way. While drugs and human trafficking continues through the legal ports of entry, we're having people turn the other way when trucks that are full of cash, millions of dollars in hard cash, are driven from north of the border to south of the border to pay the cartels. I said, well, they've lost their minds. I tried to explain that the Russians initially, when they went in, had these orders, which I'm sure many Russian generals were uncomfortable with, that said, don't shoot anyone. Literally, we don't want to shoot anybody. We want these Ukrainians to understand that we're there to protect the Russians, but we're not necessarily their enemy. So minimize, damage, not just collateral damage. We don't want to kill the Ukrainians. And of course, Russian generals had said, let's get them all in their barracks before they deploy. They're sitting in their barracks right now. Let's hit them all. No, said Putin. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to kill these people unnecessarily. Well, he truly believed these were Slavic Orthodox Christians and that something could be worked out. And as soon as they understood what was happening, that things would change. So I think it was pretty clear to me by April, after I looked at what happened in February and March, the Russians were not yet up to standard there. There's no question about that. But the Russians also went in with a very small force. Even though they had a very small force, they were facing a very large force, Larry. You had over 400,000 in the regular army, Ukrainian army. You had another 480,000 or so in reserves, and they were all in the field. And yet this small Russian force continued to make progress. And I said, well, there's something radically wrong. Ukrainians aren't that good. But it wasn't until later I realized it wasn't so much the fault of the Ukrainian soldier. It was us. It was the U.S. Army again, along with their friends in the British Army, who were giving them terrible advice, tactically disastrous. All the generals that you have running around now, like this man, Donegue, the four-star in Europe, the man who was a co-architect of the disaster in Afghanistan, the withdrawal. I mean, these people were giving everybody terrible advice. The Sakure, what was his name? Corelli or something? Cavalli, yes. It's hard to keep up with all the guys. They all seem to have emerged suddenly under Odiero, who I think decided he wanted to promote other people with vows on the ends of their names. Anyway, they were giving these people terrible advice. In the meantime, the Russians were getting progressively better and better and better. And also, I saw democracy in action for the first time in Russia. Now, let me explain this. I'm not a big advocate for liberal democracy. Don't get me wrong, but there was an operation in the south down near Heron, and this Russian brigade committed a couple of battalions of airborne troops to this operation. It didn't work well. Now, their losses were not horrendous, but they lost a lot of people, had a lot of people wounded. And these people wrote a letter to Putin, which was also passed to the newspapers, and said this commander is an idiot. He did not do his job. He did not take the precautions that were required. We were not adequately prepared. We had not established the connectivity that we have to have of all the strike units, rocket artillery, artillery in general, and so forth, so on. Well, that man was removed, and I was talking to another friend who said that's democracy in action. Putin listened, and people began to pay attention to what people on the battlefield were saying. Very positive thing. That never happens in the U.S. military. We do the opposite. We try to conceal and cover up, gross incompetence. But I was very impressed with that. I think from that point forward, in the summer of 2022, once you get sort of Ekin, who comes in there and he makes the argument for strategic elasticity, let's back off, create the right kind of defense in depth with the strike capabilities, with the ISR strike connectivity and operation, all of that. Then suddenly the Russian army begins to sort of take off. and becomes this almost invincible force. But what they did was essentially, and this the Russians will never say this, but it's what the Germans did to the Russians in World War I. If you go back and look at the German advance, the limit of advance for the German forces, the Germans in the First World War were not stupid. They said, first of all, what are we marching into Russia for? There's nothing there but Russians, you know. Yeah, be going there for. So they had Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Kaulant, the Baltic states, most of Poland all the way down to Galicia, and that's it. They stopped. And the Russians did then what the Ukrainians have done subsequently in Ukraine in this war. They relentlessly assaulted the German defense in depth, and they were absolutely annihilated through what? Mass artillery fire. And that was sort of, in my judgment, really great achievement. So from the time you build this elastic defense that is absolutely, for all intents and purposes, practically impenetrable, when you move from that forward, the Russian army is on the path to victory. There's no question about it. We never come to terms with it. Nobody looks at her. I mean, now this is Dave Petraeus say, well, now they're really good at combined arms warfare. This guy's stuck in 1942. What the hell are you talking about? This is not combined arms warfare. It's a totally different brand, a new paradigm. Well, and I think they're going to do very well. And now they're getting the new equipment, and that M1A1 tank, which I served with and utilized, it had one huge dramatic problem, the freaking engine. Yeah. It's a catastrophe. We knew in 1990 that you could track wherever an army formation went that had M1 series tanks in it from low Earth orbiting satellites. They could track the thermal signature because the damn thing was burning at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. And then, of course, without much effort at all, there were something like 42 connections in and around the engine that had all these small tubes of various alloys that carried fluid. And all you had to do was shake one of those loose. The fluid hits the engine, you got a giant fire, and your engine is essentially dead meat. You had to get a new engine. And so after the war was over, all of us, I'm talking about at least in my part of the battlefield, we first said, we got to get rid of these engines. These are a catastrophe. They're a logistical nightmare because you're drinking too much fuel too frequently. And we explained how, you can't come forward and refuel on the battlefield because if you refuel right next to the tanks are up online, everything's going to go wrong, a terrible explosion and so forth. So we were taking tanks offline, would go back, refuel and come up, but it was always hazardous. It was always a disaster and we had to refuel too much. And one of the things that I did during that war with my unit, so I said, if we stop, and we were stopped all the time, relentlessly during the so-called offensive, well, why? And it stopped because of, the generals wanted to make sure that the lines were straight and the flanks were protected and nobody moved. And so every day, you would go a couple of hours, stop, then you would sit for 2 or 3 hours and then move and then stop again after an hour of movement and wait and on and on. I mean, we sat there and watched most of the Republican Guard Corps escape on the 25th of March, February. That my point is that we said, look, you got to get rid of this. And I said, so the second or third echelon, we want to get at them. These are Iraqis, the Soviet army. So what the hell do you think you're actually doing? Nobody paid attention to it except to say this is really bad. They had a couple of aircraft shot down, but all of the aircraft were out of the action after that. They'd taken so much damage from small arms fire, they couldn't be used. Well, if you were realistic about deep operations, you wouldn't conduct it with a helicopter anyway. They behaved very differently, and he was completely unprepared for anything that he had never seen. I think that's a huge problem in the English-speaking world in our armed forces. Well, let me ask you about, we're, coming to the end of this in terms of time. How long can we stay deployed like we are in the Caribbean right now? The cocked hammer, because I've been saying we can't do that indefinitely. I would say normally 6 to 8 weeks. And again, then where do you pull in? You've got to replenish. You know that from your experience, replenishing it. See, it takes you so far. You have to have ports, and then you have a lot of people who become very tired, and your edge is not what it was when you started. So you do reach the point where you need to pull a trigger or pull back. Now, I don't know what the admirals are telling President Trump or Secretary Hegeth, but I'm sure somebody in the Navy has made these points. And the same thing applies not as rigorously to people on the ground up in Puerto Rico. I mean, I'm sure you could sit around, enjoy the good weather and so forth, but you too can become slovenly and sloppy if you're there for God knows how long. Right now, I guess we have a lot of people pouring in, what is it, Trinidad.